Hello, I'm Sultana Ali, coming to you from the LG Digital Studio at Georgetown University School of Continuing Studies. In focus today, Crisis Communications Planning. I'm joined by Brian Ellis, Executive Vice President of Padilla. Brian, thanks so much for joining us.
I'm glad I could be here today.
So experts say that crisis planning starts way before the crisis. Can you tell us what's helpful for organizations to keep in mind when they're doing crisis communications planning?
You know, I think the biggest advice I can give any client is really spend the time to sit down and think about the threats that really face your business. So most organizations can really knock out a lot of the primary threats that the company faces, and if you can get ready before the crisis strikes, you're going to be much more effective in terms of your response.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. But a crisis doesn't always spell doom, right? It can also be an opportunity to develop and build reputation. Can you give us an example of this?
I guess one of probably the easiest example I can give you is the NFL. So many of you remember the scandal around the players and the physical abuse of spouses or girlfriends in the situations there. And obviously I think that was a wake-up call for the NFL in terms of what's going on in that league. But I think the NFL looked at it and said, you know, there's a lot of good we can do in this territory through the power of the brand and the ability to leverage many other players in the league and spouses in the league to really engage in this whole process. So they've been very, very active in looking at programs and campaigns that they can get involved in support in terms of domestic abuse, physical abuse against women, and tackling that problem and really trying to reposition the NFL in this overall scandal.
That's a great point, because sometimes crises help raise visibility of certain issues you may not even be aware of and that could be hidden, and gives you an opportunity to respond to them. Now that gets to another word, which is authenticity. We hear a lot about authenticity these days. What does that mean in crisis communications?
I think first and foremost it just means transparency, at least as much as you possibly can. It's a matter of sharing information at relevant times to make sure that audiences really understand what's going on and what's happening, and they feel like you're being authentic in terms of sharing the truth. There are many times organizations don't recognize the value of being able to share information that in many cases is going to become public anyway. So there's a lot of ways organizations can get behind sharing information in a timely fashion that not only helps the consumer, but can also actually help the organization.
Yeah, and people do seem to have a general feeling when they can believe something.
Absolutely.
Right? You kind of know in your bones when you hear it, if it's true or not.
It's not only just the language that you use, but it's also in the speed by which you can share that information and get that information out to the consumer in a fashion, again, that benefits the organization as a whole. And recognizing that, you know, corporate speak, which is what we hear many times, really is not that effective. And really trying to help people understand, just speak in plain English, so that people really understand what you mean.
That's a great point. There is so much going on in the content and news information environment right now. We're in this 24/7 news cycle. So crises can be a little bit more challenging to manage. What counsel do you give organizations on the digital front when they're responding to crises?
You know, digital presents unique challenges and great opportunities. I think many organizations are somewhat overwhelmed by the speed that takes place in the digital environment and don't really recognize the opportunities that the digital environment creates. In other words, when I was a journalist, you had to go through the reporter to reach the masses. You don't have to do that anymore. You can go directly to the masses yourself through your digital properties. And it's being prepared to take advantage of those moments, those opportunities, when a crisis strikes, to go directly to the consumer to at least share your side of the story in a much more access way, meaning I have a lot more time that I can share my story versus just a minute-and-a-half news story that might appear in the nightly news.
Right, and you have a little more message control too.
Absolutely, and you saw just recently with Boeing and the situation that they're going through, where their CEO actually released a video talking about the issue versus putting himself in front of a bunch of journalists who get to ask some very difficult questions. So there are some opportunities you can actually use your digital platforms to actually have a more controlled experience in terms of how you respond to different situations.
Now, you just spoke about leadership responding to a crisis, but some leaders may not necessarily be on board with investing the resources and doing proper crisis communications planning, which I know you advocate for. How do you make the case to leaders that this is something worth investing in?
I have found it's the easiest way to handle this is very, very simply. I remind CEOs that an issue handled poorly typically results in the top guy getting fired.
Yeah.
And an issue handled well actually responds in the highlight of their career. And recognizing that if you manage it poorly, you're going to pay the price. And if you manage it well, you're going to succeed in many other areas in terms of what you're ultimately trying to pursue. So I've always found putting themselves in that shoe and understanding that dynamic tends to wake them up.
Yeah, crises can define you and your leadership for better or for worse, as well as your organization.
They really do. I think many organizations don't recognize that the challenge is everything happens so quickly, and the ability to think clearly in the midst of a crisis is very, very difficult.
Right.
So the more practice, the more pre-work you do in preparing you can really help slow it down. You hear NFL players talk about this all the time. Their rookie year, they go in and everything just moves so fast.
Right.
And yet when they're in there a few years, things start to slow down. Well, the same thing is true in issues management. The longer you do it, the more you practice, the more you understand what I call the mechanics of a response and how that works, the easier it actually becomes. And when they recognize that, it's truly a wake-up call.
And so much of that, too, is emotional, and managing the emotions of the situation and saying, what are the facts? Let me sort through that first, right? Which
is really the reason of the plan. You know, there's really no secret in the plan. The plan is actually pretty basic when you sit back and think about it. The challenge is how do I get someone from that emotional period, that emotional mindset, into action? And for many, it's very, very difficult just to go there when I don't have anything to work from. Give me just a list. That's all I really need to tell me what to do, and then I can easily move from that emotional piece into action. Those that practice it understand how quickly that can actually happen. And that's really the value of having the plan and actually practicing your plan.
And that's a great point to end on. Thank you so much for joining us today, Brian. And it's an important topic, so thanks to everyone out there for watching. Stay tuned for more from the LG Digital Studio at Georgetown School of Continuing Studies.